All right, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the IBS speaker series. I just wanted to let everyone know that we have our subtitles enabled for this. So if you have any questions about how to turn on the subtitles or turn off the subtitles, send me a message and I can help you with that. And just a few brief announcements are on the screen. We're gonna have, if you have any clarifying questions during this talk, feel free to put them in the chat and we will monitor them, but please hold most of your substantial questions until the end, and then we will have time for question and answer. As we begin the IBS speaker series, I'm going to read a land acknowledgement and then pass it off to Andy to do the introduction for our speaker today. So as we gather, we honor and acknowledge that the University of Colorado's 4 campuses are on the traditional territories and ancestral homelands of the Cheyenne, Arapaho, Ute, Apache, Comanche, Kiowa, Lakota, Pueblo, and Shoshone nations. Further, we acknowledge the 48 contemporary tribal nations historically tied to the lands that comprise what is now called Colorado. Acknowledging that we live in the homelands of Indigenous people recognizes the original stewards of these lands and their legacies. With this land acknowledgement, we celebrate the many contributions of Native peoples and also recognize the sophisticated and intricate knowledge systems Indigenous peoples have developed in relationship to their lands. All right, and with that, I will hand it off to Andy.
Thanks, Eileen. My name is Andy Baker, and I'm Director of the Program on International Development here at IBS. And I'm very pleased to introduce our speaker today. Justine Davis is currently a postdoc in the Department of Afroamerican and African American Studies at the University of Michigan. She completed her PhD last year from the University of California, Berkeley. And starting next year, she'll start as an assistant professor at the University of Michigan, also in Afro-American and African-American studies, and also in the political science department. She's here today to tell us about her book project, which considers the impact of conflict in Cote d'Ivoire and other parts of Africa. So Justine, thanks so much for being here, and take it away.
Great. Thank you, Andy. And thank you also to Karu, who invited me, and Eileen and Fernando for organizing this. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Okay. So today I'm going to be presenting one of the empirical chapters of my book project. The book is tentatively entitled Uncivic Legacies, Wartime Rebel Control and Civil Society in Africa. So the motivating question for the book project is, how does civil war affect post-conflict democratization? We know that democratization after civil war faces a number of unique obstacles, such as weak institutions, polarized society, and in countries that have experienced a civil war, a high risk of conflict recurrence. Civil society organizations are seen as purveyors of democratic norms in post-conflict settings. And so international organizations look at these organizations as ways to bring about democracy. Like the organization that was featured in the photo at the beginning, they receive funding from the United States or France, in Cote d'Ivoire and across Africa. Almost $25 billion has been allocated to civil society organizations in African countries that have experienced a civil war. They are primarily focused on reducing violence, encouraging democracy, and fostering development through their activities. And they're seen as more efficient, accountable, reliable, and transparent than government, which is why international donors prefer to fund these types of organizations to participate in both democratization processes, but also in peace building. However, and one of the main goals of my book project is to answer these questions, we know very little about who leads these organizations. Do they themselves hold democratic beliefs? And do their actions reflect pro-social attitudes? So these are the countries in Africa that have experienced a civil war in the past 20 years. Sierra Leone, so this is some quotes that I'm going to put up from a USAID survey that looked at civil society organization sustainability in 2015. And in Sierra Leone, the report said that some NGOs have lost credibility because they're seen as protecting the interests of political parties. In Liberia, the public and government view these organizations as politicized and act hostile towards them. In South Sudan, as the conflict has deepened, national NGOs have faced allegations of being biased towards certain political parties. And in Mozambique, the public sees the initiatives put on by these civil society organizations as benefiting the leaders rather than the citizens. And so I just wanted to put up some of these examples to demonstrate that we don't actually know a lot about how civil society organizations are operating in post-conflict settings. And we further don't know how war can actually impact their ability to deliver democracy in these post-conflict settings. And so I focus on two research questions. The first one I will be answering here during this talk in this empirical chapter that I'll be presenting. And it is, what are the effects of living under rebel control on civil society leaders' behavior? The broader book project then looks at how this wartime experience that these leaders have survived and been through, how it affects their ability to bring about post-conflict democratization. And so just to preview the talk for today, I'm going to go over the existing explanations and the kind of conventional model of civil society and democratization. I will present my theory that I've developed on the wartime experiences of civic leaders. I'll then present the research design, which included interviews, surveys, and a lab in the field with civil society leaders in Côte d'Ivoire. And then the main finding, which is that civil society leaders who lived under rebel control are less likely to redistribute and more likely to discriminate against the outgroups. And so that's kind of the key takeaway. So first, who are these civic leaders? Who are these civil society leaders? So first, they're consequential actors for development and democracy. They work with international donors and government officials. They interact with local communities, and often they're the only folks that are interacting with local communities, more so than politicians or local authorities. They also are they're also more likely to be educated than the general population, to be urban-based as well. A civil society organization is one that is formally registered, private, and not-for-profit with public welfare goals. For this project, I focus explicitly on civil society organizations that are created and run by local populations with headquarters in country. So this wouldn't be something like the Red Cross, but something like a local organization in Western Côte d'Ivoire that was started by an Ivorian. But often these organizations are funded by international donors. And I choose to focus on organizations that are created and run by local populations because I'm particularly interested in how the war has impacted these individuals. So the existing explanations are that civil society is expected to develop tolerance, moderation, trust, and reciprocity in both its members and its leaders, as well as anyone who interacts with these organizations. Further, in conflict settings, civil society organizations are expected to decrease violence, increase cooperation, and reduce intergroup conflict. But I argue, and I join a number of scholars who do the same, that the institutional environment in which civil society emerges and operates can actually induce some negative behaviors. And so the conventional model of civil society, you could imagine it looks a little bit like this. So civil war, as I said, and as we know, can have a negative effect on the ability of countries to democratize. And then civil society is supposed to have a very positive, robust effect on democratization. And what I want to do is I want to update this model by saying that actually civil war affects civil society, which then, whether it's negative or a neutral effect and potentially a positive effect. And this can then impact the ability of these organizations and their leaders to contribute to democratization. So I'm going to present now the theory of the wartime experiences of civic leaders. So first, I look at the impact of rebel takeover. And I argue, like other scholars in this kind of emerging literature on rebel governance, that rebel takeover represents a breakdown of order and often leads to the introduction of new institutions. I then argue that this generates uncertainty for civilians because the aim of the rebels is to remove the existing political order. I also argue that rebel takeover is more destabilizing for civil society leaders than continuous government control. Not to say that war itself is not traumatic for those who live under government control, but the fact that when rebels take over and they institute new institutions or don't or use violence indiscriminately, makes it a kind of a unique experience for civil society leaders compared to those who live continuously under government control. And so I developed two types of uncertainty that these civil society leaders face that under rebel control. And the first is governance uncertainty, and where they have questions over who is in charge. And so we know that often, in contested areas that fall under rebel control, where the government is attempting to retake that territory, we see high contestation over power. And so one day it might be the rebels ruling, the next day it might be the government. And so this leads to considerable uncertainty for civil society leaders. It also may lead to uncertainty over insecurity, over public goods provision. And so if you're living under rebel control and you don't know if the rebels themselves are going to provide public goods, whether the government will be able to continue to provide public goods, and if there's contestation, whether public goods are even going to be provided by anyone. The second type of uncertainty that civil society leaders face is social uncertainty. Who can be trusted? And so in context where the Civil War exacerbates the cleavages that already existed in society on which the war was fought over, this can lead to high levels of distrust and victimization among the civilian population. And so it makes it that much harder for civil society leaders to know with whom can they work and with whom and who can they trust. Civil society leaders are first responders during wartime. They're often who international donors look to deliver humanitarian aid. And thus, when they experience uncertainty, it affects how they're able to interact with formalized entities, access communities, and receive funding from outside and inside of the country. And so I argue that under conditions of governance uncertainty, civil society leaders begin to discount the value of helping others and then begin to reserve more for themselves as insurance. And this leads them to redistribute less and keep more for themselves. And I call this the egocentric effect. Under conditions of social uncertainty, when there is uncertainty over who can be trusted, civil society leaders begin to rely on cues to avoid the risk of helping enemies. And so they will discriminate based on identity, primarily things that are ascriptive, such as ethnicity. And in the context of sub-Saharan Africa, often ethnicity maps onto political identity. And so this leads to what I call the discriminatory effect. I further developed the theory out to argue that these behaviors persist into the post-war period because the underlying conditions that led to the war still continue in a lot of contexts. So polarization, grievances related to discrimination, they still continue to exist. And so these civil society leaders that have developed these attitudes and behaviors continue to demonstrate them even after the war has been over. Further, they learned that these behaviors that they used were actually effective during wartime, and so they continue to use them. And finally, they kind of inculcate new leaders through the process of individuals joining the organization or volunteering or becoming new leaders. And those leaders replicate these successful strategies of their predecessors. So to recap, I argue that rebel control is more destabilizing than continuous government control because it introduces two types of uncertainty: governance uncertainty and social uncertainty. And both of these types of uncertainty result in negative pro-social behaviors. The egocentric effect, meaning that the civil society leaders will be less likely to distribute resources, and the discriminatory effect, where they'll be more likely to discriminate against groups that are different from themselves. And so the observable implications are such that in comparison to civil society leaders who lived under government control, leaders in former rebel-controlled areas are more egocentric, they distribute less, and more discriminatory, they share less with outgroups. And so the book project is based primarily in Côte d'Ivoire, which is in West Africa, and experienced the civil war from 2002 to 2011. During that time, rebels controlled almost 50% of the national territory, which is this area in gray. In 2003, the French military and the UN that was in Côte d'Ivoire set up what's called a zone de confiance, or a buffer zone, which is these black lines, to keep the rebels and the government from fighting. And so effectively what this meant is that from 2003 to 2007 and thereafter, the rebels controlled this 50% of national territory with very little interference from the government. In 2010, the rebel-supported candidate won elections. He actually was not able to take power right then because the incumbent held on to power, and there was violent clashes between their supporters, resulting in 3,000 people killed, and didn't end until the French again intervened and actually removed the former president and sent him to the ICC in 2011, so about in April of 2011. And he has now been acquitted, and has actually, he should be coming back to Côte d'Ivoire in the next few months. And so compared to government-controlled departments, just to give you kind of a glimpse of this uncertainty that I'm talking about, particularly this governance uncertainty with regards to contestation, more rebel-controlled departments experienced battles than government-controlled departments. Rebel-perpetrated violence only occurred in the department, which is the third lowest administrative unit in Côte d'Ivoire. Only occurred in those departments that were controlled by rebels. However, the more rebel-controlled departments experienced violence against civilians by government forces. So civilians living under rebel control not only had to deal with violence from the rebels, but also from the government. So it makes it difficult to actually study what I'm interested in, which is, the impact of rebel control and civil society organization leader behavior. Is that, as you can tell, the geographic distribution of rebel control and government control. So as you can see, the northern part of Côte d'Ivoire was controlled by rebels, not the southern part. The southern part is significantly wealthier than the northern part. The economic capital is Abidjan here in the southwest or southeast. And so the northern departments are quite far from the economic center. And as you can imagine, the area that fell under rebel control contains different ethnic groups. And so it makes it very difficult to study. So to overcome the differences that exist between these two areas, I use a pre-treatment matching case selection strategy. And so what I do is I condition on 5 variables: the distance to Abidjan, the economic capital, the incumbent vote share just before the start of the war in 2001, the percent of ethnic groups that are considered northerners, so the South Monday and the Voltaic, the North Monday and the Voltaic, the level of average night lights in these departments, and the average child mortality, both of which are sort of proxies for poverty. And so the goal of using this matching case selection is to help eliminate confounding observable geographic and socio-political factors that make these two areas different. And so this results in this distribution. There are 8 former rebel-controlled departments and 13 former government-controlled departments that ultimately end up in my sample. And just to give you an idea of like how well the matching actually works, this is the covariates, the 5 that I matched on, and then other pre-war variables. And so the matching does pretty well. You will note that the distance to Abidjan is still statistically significant, and that is, you know, a function of the fact that, you know, all of the northern departments are far from Abidjan. But generally, the match is pretty good. And so what I did is, using this these cases, these departments, I then sampled civil society organization leaders from these departments. And I traveled throughout Côte d'Ivoire, not just in the selected departments, to conduct interviews and do participant observation of these civil society organization activities. I conducted an organizational and individual survey of these leaders. The organizational survey goal was to find out more about what they do, how long they've existed, who their main funders are. The individual survey is more about their own experiences as leaders. And I conducted a lab in the field with these leaders in those 21 selected departments. And so today I'm going to be presenting primarily the data from the lab in the field. And this is a picture of the lab in the field in Western Côte d'Ivoire. And so I use the lab in the field in order to bring subjects together in a common location in their own environment to study their behavior. So in this context, it was civil society leaders. It's useful for measuring behavior and attitudes, and particularly behavior. And I adapted experimental games to the local Ivorian context. So one of the main issues that I confronted when I got to Côte d'Ivoire was being able to build a population frame from which to sample. As you can imagine, during the war, there has been significant loss of administrative data across the country. This picture on the right is from 2016. It's the prefecture of Bouaké. Bouaké is the former rebel capital of Côte d'Ivoire, in Côte d'Ivoire. And as you can see, there's paper strewn about. So when I arrived at the prefecture of Bouaké to get lists of organizations that I could interview, they told me that they no longer had those lists. And so this presented a bit of a challenge for me in order to build the population frame from which I could sample. And so I employed a couple of strategies in order to do that. First, in the selected cases, the 21 departments that I showed on that map, I collected any list that I could get of grassroots and professional organization leaders from, whether they were part of national, department, or local networks. The European Union actually was conducting kind of a census of civil society organizations around the same time I was there, which was super helpful, as well as other international donors. And then I visited prefectures like the one in the photo before, as well as mayor's offices to collect any lists that they might have, and kind of collated this all together. From that list, I then had a team of research assistants who called folks and asked them to participate in the study, but also to suggest people that we might get in touch with that might not be on our list. And so then I solicited participation in the organization survey, which ultimately ended up with 163 organizations. And if you participated in this organization survey, I then invited you to participate in a workshop and the lab in the field. And so the lab in the field was held in 4 different locations in Côte d'Ivoire over the course of 2 weeks. And so this is the departments that went to each one. So the pink departments went to San Pedro, the purple departments went to Man, Daloa, etc. So this might not be the ideal strategy to conduct these lab in the fields. I think I would have preferred to be able to invite everyone to one central location, but this just wasn't logistically feasible. And so I'm happy to answer in the Q&A any questions that you might have about whether there are workshop effects or whether there are effects of having folks from both government and rebel in the same workshops. I'm happy to talk more about that. So what I did is I embedded the lab in the field in a capacity building workshop. And the reason I did this was twofold. First, I wanted to introduce realism into the lab in the field. Most of these folks have not had experience doing any sort of like laboratory activity. And so I felt it would be kind of artificial to invite them to just play these games and then send them home. So I embedded it in a capacity building workshop, which is something that they have attended. Many of these leaders have attended, put on by international organizations all the time. The other reason that I embedded it inside of this capacity building workshop was because when I was doing my interviews, folks kept asking me like, what are we going to get from you in exchange for us helping you with your project? And so I asked them, what would you like to know, or what would you like? And they wanted to learn more about volunteering and fundraising in the US. And so with my research assistants, we created 2 presentations, one on volunteering and the other on fundraising, that drew from the nonprofit sector in the US. And so the lab in the field participants first took a survey, then they attended these presentations, and then they did a series of dictator games. There were at most 24 leaders per session. And this is kind of the demographic breakdown of these folks. And so there were 167 leaders from 126 organizations that participated in the lab in the field. 41% were from rebel departments, 21% female, between 35 and 44 years of age was the average. Most had completed some secondary school, about 17%, Muslim, 26% from those northern ethnic groups, and 46% support the incumbent, so a pretty split sample as far as political affiliation goes. One thing I want to highlight is that the most common domain that they worked in was social cohesion. And I think this is important because when thinking about these kind of pro-social norms and attitudes, that's what these organizations are supposed to be building, right? When they're thinking about social cohesion, they're supposed to be encouraging inclusivity and altruism amongst the populations that they're working with. And so I think it's particularly important that the most common domain that these organizations worked in was actually social cohesion. And so their attitudes and behaviors can have implications for their ability to actually contribute to this social cohesion. And then about 43% of the organizations were funded by international partners. So they played a series of dictator games, 9 in total, in which the respondent themselves decided how to allocate a sum of real money that they received at the end of the lab in the field. They could keep up to 6,000 francs CFA, which is roughly $10 for themselves, or give away 7,500 francs CFA, which is $12 to others. On the right are some gentlemen playing the games on the tablets. They played alone on the tablets. They actually didn't interact with the recipients at all. And the recipients were actually unknown, but I did provide them with some description of the recipient's identity. And so they played 3 rounds of 3 games, resulting in 9 games. In the first round, they had the choice to allocate 1,000 francs CFA in 100 francs CFA coins to an association that was from their department or not from their department, with the majority of members that were the same ethnicity as them or not, and then with the majority of members as that were the same political ideology or not. And so they could choose between themselves in these 2 kind of categories. And this is what it looked like for them on the tablets. They had the 10 coins, and then they could allocate, 3 coins to myself, 4 coins to an association whose members share my political opinions, and then 3 coins to an association whose members don't. In the second round, it's the same, but I limited how much they could keep so that they wouldn't just be able to keep all the money each time. And so they played the same 3 games, but this time they could only keep 500 CFA. And in the third game, I forced them to discriminate. And so they still had to allocate 1,000 francs CFA, but this time in 500 CFA coins or in bills. And so they either had to discriminate against themselves or against one of the other 2 groups, because only one individual could get both coins. Or no individual could get both coins. And so the outcomes that I used to test the theory that I developed earlier are, and the egocentric effect is the sum of the amount that they kept for themselves. And for the discriminatory effect, I look at the share of the total amount not kept that is allocated to non-co-ethnic, non-co-partisan, and different departments. So they're outgroup. Right, and so for the results. So just to recap the theory, I argue that rebel control is more destabilizing than government control because of governance uncertainty and social uncertainty. And this results in the egocentric effect, where civil society leaders redistribute less, and the discriminatory effect, where civil society leaders share less with the outgroup, with their outgroups. And so this is just a graphic of the mean amount kept by civil society leaders that participated in the lab in the field. And so as you can see here, the darker blue on the right are civil society leaders who come from former rebel controlled departments. And they kept on average 67% of the amount that they could keep for themselves. On the other side, on the other hand, those who are from the former government controlled departments kept on average 56% of what they could. And this is an 11 percentage point difference. And I think one thing to note about this is that these leaders were actually kind of primed to be altruistic because we had just talked about volunteerism and altruism and philanthropy in the sessions. So it is also kind of interesting that even though I kind of primed them about, being altruistic, that they still kept more than 50% on average. For the outgroup, the amount allocated to the outgroup, I find that civil society leaders from former rebel controlled departments were less likely to give to the outgroup than those who lived in former government controlled departments. They only gave roughly 28% to groups that were different from themselves, whereas those who came from government departments gave roughly 36%. And these results hold across a number of specifications, so controlling for individual and organization level characteristics such as gender, age, education, northern ethnicity, as well as organization level characteristics such as whether the organization is internationally funded, the size of the organization, and whether it was founded before, during, or after the war. They also hold when excluding departments far from the zone de confiance. And so if you recall from the map that I showed earlier, there was a cluster of departments that were very similar around the zone de confiance. And then there were some that were kind of in the far southwest. And those departments were included in the sample because of the cacao trade and production. And so there is a lot more ethnic diversity in those departments. But you could imagine that those departments that are in the far southwest are different in some sort of way. And so I exclude those departments and just look at those that are kind of clustered around that zone de confiance, and the results continue to hold. And I also look just at those who could be considered wartime leaders. And so these are the folks who started their organization before the war or during the war, and they kind of would have been affected most probably by the impact of living under rebel control. And it holds for those folks, as well as for folks that became civil society leaders after the war. So this is, that was kind of a systematic examination of a test of the theory that I presented. But here I want to just kind of walk you through what this looks like in one particular department. In Mon, which is in Western Cote d'Ivoire. And it's a beautiful place. It's got rolling hills, it's very green. And so I went to Mon before I conducted the lab in the field and conducted a number of interviews with local civil society organization leaders. And here are just some quotes to illustrate the kind of egocentric effect that they themselves describe, not of themselves, but of others, their peer leaders. So one woman leader said that 75% or more of the organizations here in Mon are not doing the work they are funded to do. Another leader lamented that during the war, organizations stole rice instead of distributing it. Another said they just bouffe the money, and bouffe is kind of a slang term in French to mean they just eat it, they just keep it for themselves. And then finally, one leader said, when you see people dying of hunger, and these organizations steal the money, he was just really, tired of this kind of attitude. With regards to the discriminatory effect, these leaders were quite quick actually to call out their fellow organization leaders and say things like they only help out their own ethnicity and forget about others. They see other organizations as the enemy. One leader who actually was originally from Abidjan but was working in Mon currently, he said, "I'm Ebrié," which is an ethnic group that's from Abidjan. I said, "I have no friends here. It's difficult to work with these organizations here." And so these quotes and this kind of these interviews that I did actually informed very much the theory that I developed and also subsequently the lab in the field, because I kept hearing this throughout my interviews in Western Cote d'Ivoire and in former rebel-controlled areas, that these organizations felt that their co-organization, their peers were more egocentric and more discriminatory. And so just to remind you again of the theory, I argue that rebel control is more destabilizing than government control. And the mechanism here is uncertainty. So uncertainty over who is in charge and uncertainty over who can be trusted. And so to get at this question, this kind of uncertainty, I ask a battery of questions. To what extent do you agree with the following statements? They answer this question in the survey before they participated in the lab in the field games. During the war and for governance uncertainty, I felt in danger. I did not feel that the rule of law persisted. I did not know who was in charge. And for social uncertainty, I feared the rebels, I feared the government. I felt discriminated against due to my ethnicity, religion, or political allegiance. And so this is the distribution of folks that said that they strongly agreed or strongly agreed with those statements. And as you can see here, the darker blue on the right is the former rebel control, the civil society organization leaders from the former rebel controlled departments. And on the left, in the lighter blue, are those from former government controlled departments. And across the board, those who lived under rebel control felt higher levels of governance uncertainty. And this also plays out when it comes to social uncertainty. Civil society leaders that lived under rebel control experienced greater uncertainty, but they also exhibited greater egocentrism and discrimination, as I've shown. And even when those leaders in government zones who did experience some level of uncertainty, they were not more likely to be egocentric or discriminatory. And so we can see that if you compare those who scored highly on these uncertainty measures in rebel versus government zones, the relationship still holds. The leaders from the former rebel controlled departments were still more likely to keep more for themselves and more likely to discriminate against the outgroup. So to go back to Mon and kind of use the case study to illustrate some of these these two mechanisms, I draw from interviews that I conducted with Madam C. Madam C had been working in the civil society sector since the 90s, and she started her own organization that helped women and orphans. And she told me that when the rebels first arrived in Mon, they said they weren't staying. And so many people were welcoming even, and at least were pretty neutral and thought, okay, well, they're not staying. So they're just on their way to Abidjan to take over and they'll leave us alone. However, once the zone de confiance was established and the rebels kind of settled in, people became afraid, she said. She said that the rebels ruled by laws of rebellion, which basically meant there was no rule of law, and used violence indiscriminately and with impunity. Her organization was called Saint Philomène, and it's funded by some international organizations. And she said that she was often threatened because of the work that she was trying to do. She tried to go into a village and the rebels said, are you trying to go there to help people, or are you just going there to report how many have been killed to the Red Cross so that we get in trouble, the rebels? She herself was accused of supporting the government due to her ethnicity. Her name sounded like a name that was the same, that comes from the same ethnic group as the former president. And so she was actually arrested and thrown into jail, despite her attempts to say, no, I'm not related to the president, and has to now still deal with encountering the people who put her in prison all those years ago. And she said that working during the war, but also today, that many citizens are skeptical of these organizations because they think that they are either partisan with the rebels or now the current government, or partisan with the former government. And so even the citizen population is distrustful of these organization leaders. And so I'm actually not going to go over this section of alternative explanations, but I'm happy to talk through those with folks. I see I only have about 3 minutes left, but yes, can come back to those if folks have questions about alternative explanations that you might be thinking about in your head right now. And so what I've done in this project is elaborate a theory of how the wartime experiences of civil society leaders affects behavioral outcomes. I've demonstrated that there is subnational variation in the impact of civil war on the potential of civil society to contribute to democratization. And I leveraged lab in the field design with a pre-treatment matching technique to answer theoretically motivated yet difficult to answer questions. So as far as the implications go, if civil society leaders who have lived under rebel control are more egocentric and more discriminatory, this can have ramifications on the ability on their ability to bring about post-war democratization. They may actually reinforce cleavages that were worsened during the war. They may also contribute to polarization. These accusations of partisanship and citizens thinking that they support one part of the government or not can have ramifications for the delivery of things such as voter education, as well as public goods. And finally, civil society leaders may inhibit the distribution of resources inclusively. And so if they're actively discriminating against groups that are different from themselves, that may mean that those groups aren't accessing those resources, but further that those groups may begin to distrust these organizations and distrust the process in general. And so a key takeaway is that we cannot assume that civil society leaders will contribute to democracy without considering the dynamics that shape their behavior, such as their experiences during war. Now, this is not to say that we shouldn't fund these organizations. As I mentioned before, these organizations are sometimes the only ones in the communities bringing these public goods or distributing resources, providing civic education and things of that sort to these local communities. What I think one of the policy takeaways is that we need to better understand how the war has affected individuals differently across the country, and then act in a way that kind of takes that into consideration. I also think I'm hopeful that as Côte d'Ivoire moves in a more positive development and democratization trajectory, that these behaviors and attitudes will no longer be beneficial for these civil society leaders, and they'll stop using them as often as they did. And so as I started at the beginning, this is one of the empirical chapters of my book project, where I discuss the puzzle of civil society-led democratization in post-conflict settings. I present the theory that I presented today. I also develop a theory of civil society leader behavior and democratic success, which is linking this egocentric and discriminatory effects to actual contributions to democracy. One of the empirical chapters I presented today was the wartime experiences of these leaders. I have 3 additional empirical chapters, one of which looks at citizen and civil society relationships in post-conflict Cote d'Ivoire. I am currently working on that data collection effort, hoping to do some surveys and lab in the fields this summer with these citizens that are ostensibly affected by these behaviors on the part of civil society leaders. So thank you for listening, and I look forward to your questions. Oh, there was a raised hand. I didn't see it.
That's me. I just raised it. So.
Oh, okay, great. Okay.
Thank you very much, Justine. Before we get to David's question, Jaroslav had already noted that he had a question, so if we can go in that order. Thanks.
Okay. Is it better if I stop sharing so I can see people's faces, and then if anyone needs particular slides, I can bring it back up? Does that work?
Sure.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right. Oh, now I can see your faces. I couldn't see any faces when I was presenting.
You ready for the question then?
Yes, please. Thank you.
All right. That's a great talk. I really enjoyed it, and really appreciate all the lengths you've gone to get good inferences and all that good stuff. I have a couple of questions actually. So one of them, since the topic is democratization, there's a research that shows that ability of countries to democratize and then to hang on to the democracy also depends on their external environment. Specifically, is their territory contested by other states? And given that this is an African case, yeah, you probably have internal contestation of territory. So that's part of what civil war is fought over, who controls what chunk of the country. And also, given that the locals did not get to draw their own boundaries, it's a fairly typical scenario in Africa that a country's borders are externally contested as well. So I'm wondering if you could maybe speak to that issue a bit, kind of how it might affect your inference. And then the other question is a lot more case specific. So you mentioned, I love the photo of all the records flying around. And while this is typical in a civil war setting, I think there's an extra problem in the Ivory Coast case. And that is that one of the key problems or one of the key issues in the war was who gets to vote and who gets to be on these voting rolls. Because there was issues of who's the true Ivorian and who's not. And so voting records in particular were kind of a target here. So again, I think you're absolutely right. This kind of stuff happens in any civil war, but here it may have been actually part of the war. These records, and then that might have, of course, affect your ability, kind of who you contact and how you find people and all that, given that the records themselves were targeted. So if you could please speak to that issue and kind of how it may or may not impact any inferences you could be getting from your research. Thank you. Great talk again. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you. So the external environment. So this is really interesting, and I actually want to delve more into it. So the Ivorian Civil War started just shy of the Liberian Civil War ending. And so one of the things that came up in my interviews, especially in the West under rebel control, was that there were mercenaries from Liberia, Angola, and even South Africa that were fighting on either side. And so that also added to this uncertainty for these leaders. In one interview, a woman was like, yeah, we heard people speaking English, and so we knew they weren't Ivorian, but they had guns, and so we didn't mess with them. And so I think this kind of dynamic of mercenaries and militias in particular is something that I want to develop more in both in the theory section, but also in my kind of mechanism development, because this is something that I think is impactful. I think it just makes that uncertainty more acute, because it's now you don't even have to worry about your own people, like you have to worry about folks coming from across the border. The citizenship question is great. I think it shapes a lot of the dynamics that we see in the Ivorian conflict. As far as whether it affects how I reached folks. So because I didn't necessarily use official lists, which could be, distorted by the fact that people who don't have Ivorian citizenship can't register an organization, I actually included folks that were leaders of organizations that were like Burkinabe living in X place. So it wasn't exclusive to necessarily like you having citizenship, but most of the folks that all of the folks that I had interviewed had lived in Côte d'Ivoire during the war. Yeah. David had his hand.
Yeah, David and then Karu. Thanks.
So fabulous, I mean, really interesting project. This was kind of a clarification question, but I didn't want to interrupt. You had earlier a slide that had a map of Côte d'Ivoire, and it had the rebel. Okay.
I'll put it back up.
Yeah,
that helps.
I think the question started there, and then I realized, okay. Let me see here. Okay, so the darker areas here correspond to rebel control, the lighter areas government control.
That's right.
Okay, and you have this zone in between. Mm-hmm. So I guess my question here was, given when you do your lab and you have civil society leaders who are with NGOs in the zone, in this zone region, are they considered to be under rebel or government control?
Yeah. So this is great. So the way that this is coded, whether you're rebel control or a government controlled department, is whether the department capital is in one or the other. And so the zone does go in some, so like, for example, here in like Zuckerberg, the zone does cut across the department, but Zuckerberg was actually like the city of Zuckerberg was actually in government control. And so this cuts across an area that's like not very inhabited. And almost all of my leaders came from urban settings. So they actually were drawn from the capitals of these departments. A few came from like, some villages, but almost all of the, I think 80%, if I recall, of the leaders worked in urban settings, but then moved out to rural settings. So they, their organization was housed out in the city, and then they went to the villages to deliver the goods.
Okay, so a quick follow-up then, because I guess what I had been thinking was that you might have three categories: under rebel control, under government control, and something in between or under international control. But it sounds like you don't really have leaders that fit. That third category really doesn't make sense. But if it did, I wonder what the results would look like if you separated that group out.
Yeah, I also would wonder what it would look like. So there aren't anyone that like live in the zone de confiance. But as I'm moving forward with the rest of the book and thinking about the citizen level survey, I am going to possibly sample citizens that live in those zones, because they, the villages fall into those areas, and I'm trying to think about how to leverage that point, like to bring up your very point of whether those folks' experiences with civil society organizations are going to be different, which I imagine they are, because their access was different than if they were in the firmly in the government or in the rebel control. So I will try to leverage that. So that's great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks. Ru and then Clara.
Hi, Justine. It's so great to see you. I wish that you were really here in person, but this was just wonderful. And thank you so much for sharing this with us. I just love it. I mean, I think this is such a cool project, and you present like so many different layers of it that it's really convincing. So my questions are probably, I think that that's kind of a compliment, that my questions are more about like what is a little bit outside of the study and what does it tell us. And so these are just things to think about, that I'd love to talk more with you about at some point. But the first thing I was thinking, one of the reasons I find the literature on civil society so fascinating is that everybody knows it's complicated. It's like an area where we know there's like all kinds of inputs and then all kinds of effects and feedback and that involve people's experiences and organizations. And so I'm really curious, I think your story about the individual behavioral consequences of civil war, changing how leaders think and act, and then that has sort of broader implications for civil society outcomes. I mean, I think that's super important and a part of the literature that's really been missing. So first of all, I just love it. But I'm curious to hear more about what those outcomes really are. Is it do you think we end up with organizations that work much worse? Is there more corruption? And your examples are just brilliant, sort of people saying they don't feel like the organization serve them. But I wonder if maybe this is a next step of a project of kind of thinking through some of those, what does that then look like at the societal or organizational level? And then how does that change what civil society can really accomplish in those settings? So that's kind of a big mess of things, but that's what I was sort of just puzzling over as I was listening to you talk. And then I have one other sort of maybe easier question, maybe harder. And that's, I was also thinking about, are there factors that you think mitigate the negative effects of wartime experiences for civil society leaders? And that's sort of what do we do with this really important information that leaders had very different experiences under government control or under rebel control, and that then changed a lot of things, right? But is it I'm just really curious about whether that's really through experiences of violence or, and if there's things in a post-war setting that can be done to support those civil society leaders, what makes it better, I guess, is sort of one way to think about it. I mean, lots more. I'd love to talk. Let's plan to talk more at some point, but those are my initial thoughts. Thank you.
Yeah, so this is great. And I think it is the first point that you brought up, I think, is one of the challenges, I guess, of challenges and I guess opportunities of the book project, I think, because I wanted, this was always the bigger question for me. It's how does the war affect this ability of these organizations to actually do what they're supposed to do? And so I'm trying to come up with a way to get at this. And so one of the things that I've been thinking about is so going to this. So the first thing I need to show is that the citizens actually experience these attitudes and behaviors, right? So do citizens see these organizations discriminating against them, or not getting money but not giving it to them? And I have some preliminary evidence that this is the case from Abidjan. I did a survey in 2015, and folks, especially people who are not the same ethnic group as the current president, were oh yeah, those organizations, they just get international money and they keep it for themselves. And so there is this reputation. And so I want to first make sure that is the case, that people are actually feeling it. And then I want to know if that has impacts on the way that they ultimately take up what the organizations are giving them. So the thing that's most concrete for me, I think, and the thing that I am primarily interested in when it comes to democratization is things like civic education and voter education, which we know are primarily done by these organizations, in collaboration with electoral commissions, but generally primarily by these organizations. And so if, as a citizen, I know, or I think that this organization, is likely to discriminate against people like me, or isn't going to allocate the resources as they're supposed to, am I going to participate with this organization's activities? And what are the ramifications for that if I'm someone who doesn't know how to register to vote, but now I don't go and talk to these organizations and learn to register to vote because I don't trust them? And so it's kind of these micro impact. So it's not necessarily democratization at a macro level. It's more about the individual, the ability to impact citizens' response and citizens' engagement with these practices that I'm particularly interested in. And I'm hoping that this survey and lab that I'm going to do in the summer with the citizens will kind of get at this more concretely for to answer this kind of the last part of the theory. I didn't know if there were other questions, but I can keep I can keep answering Kira's question.
Thank you. We just have one last question by Clara.
Okay.
Just to give Clara the floor because she already asked for the question. Thank you.
Okay.
Hi, Justin. So good to
Hi.
see you. Great project and great presentation.
Thank
So
you.
I just had like small questions and like broader questions for your project. The small questions were like, as I was listening to this project, I'm like, who are these civic leaders in rebel regions, right? They are, I can't even imagine doing that in a rebel region, right? Trying to help people. So they may be, I think all civic society leaders are socially conscious and ambitious and resourceful. But I wonder if there's like a difference between civil leaders in rebel regions versus civil leaders in the South, right? And I think there could be personal characteristics, but also organizational characteristics. I know you control for like the size of the organization, but how stable is their funding? So people in the rebel regions may be less funded and less established, so they may be just anything I can get at that moment, I'll get it, and then I'll worry about that later. Whereas people in the richer regions, they be like, oh, I'm good, I can be more generous, right? So I guess it may be difficult to survey them again, but I think if you could go, if you could look at the civil leaders, not just in the matched regions, but like in the rebel regions and in the South, and then say like if there are personal characteristic differences of leaders, those in the rebel regions are more ambitious, more selfish, or more egocentric, or there is no difference. But so is it the characteristics or the rebel experience that have changed them, right? And then to help with that, with the data that you currently have, maybe you can parse out leaders that have been there before the war, and then leaders that became a leader during and after that could get it. I know it would reduce the number of cases, but you can kind of show in the descriptive statistics that. And then the other two are like kind of broader questions about, if I guess we're out of time, but if you are, I'm sure the international organization would be very interested in hearing your research, right, about this, and how can they make sure that they can give money to those leaders in rebel regions, but then it'll be distributed equally across groups rather than just one group taking it whole. Yeah. So thank you.
Great. Are we at time, or should I answer? I'm happy to answer.
Well, if you have a couple of like a quick reaction, that would be great. But yeah.
Okay. So I have a lot of appendix slides that I didn't get to show. And I deal with these very issues. So I look at the distribution of domains. So the folks that were under rebel control are more likely to be in education, health, was also pretty high, has a really high HIV rate in the former rebel controlled areas linked to the war. But then I control for these domain differences in particular. That's one of the organizational controls. I also I use the population frame, like the distribution of these organizations, and look at whether there are differences on some like observable characteristics. So woman, man, things that I could derive just from their names or from the, because I didn't take the survey, to kind of get at this question of selection, which I think is what you're asking about. And I think, if I break it out by war created, pre-war, war, and post-war, the folks that are in the war and the pre-war are less egocentric than the post-war folks. But if I drop those post-war people and just look at the kind of the wartime folks, this result holds. And so in both cases, on the government and rebel side, the people who started organizations after the war are more egocentric in both cases. But the rebel folks are just like significantly more than the government. And I think this has a lot to do with funding, which is what you are bringing up. There was kind of a flock to, oh, hey, there's all these international donors giving out money. I'll start an organization. But there are people like that on both sides of the line, right? And I think that's something really important to bring up, is that yes, there are probably selfish, terrible people that start organizations and are on both, but they're on both sides of the line, right? And I don't have migration. I don't have people that are like, I'm selfish, I'm gonna go live in the rebel controlled area, right? But I also like want to like really illustrate, like really reiterate, because I interviewed these folks, and almost all of them were really trying to just contribute to the betterment of their communities, right? I don't think, unless they were really deceptive somehow and like convinced me otherwise. But I think that most of them were actually, they want to behave altruistically, or they want to contribute to society in a positive way, which is why I don't think that the policy implication is don't fund them or don't support them. I think to kind of Kara's question, it's more of like tailoring how we do it. So whether it's, working with them to overcome this kind of discriminatory behavior. So one thing that I didn't get to talk about, but I think is fascinating, is that in the games, everyone always gave something to their non-co-ethnic. And I think it's because they know that they're not supposed to discriminate against their non-co-ethnics. But what comes out is they don't think about that in the same way as partisanship. And so they were quick to not to give anything to their non-co-partisan. And so I do think it's possible to, even if it's like against their desire to not discriminate, you can encourage them through, funding guidelines, or through restrictions on funding. If you don't go to these communities, you don't get funding. There are ways to kind of encourage it, and it seems to kind of already be manifesting itself. Yeah.
Very interesting. Thank you very much again, Justine, and thanks for those of you who were able to stay till a little bit past the time, including, of course, Justine. And yeah, so that's a great sign. Of course, it was a very nice talk, and a couple of people sent their regards on the chat because they had to go. But thank you again, and join me in thanking Justine again. Thank you.
Thank you all for coming as well, and great questions.
Thank you,
Thank you
everyone.
very much.
Justine, I'll put through some of that last piece of paperwork, and then once we get the video recording, I can send you that link as well. So
okay, thank you.
Great. Awesome. Thank you.
Justine, I really am like feeling sad that we don't actually have you here in person, and we don't get to hang out. It's like a beautiful day in Boulder. It would be so fun to go for a walk and that kind of thing. But maybe we can touch base and find a time to like chat a little bit more at some point.
That would be awesome. Yes, okay, please.
I'll send you an email. But it was great to see you. Thanks so much.
Thank you, and thanks for the invitation too.
Good to see you, Justine. Maybe we can also chat.
Yeah, it was good to see you. I forgot. I like totally blanked that you were at Colorado. It's so great that you were able to come to the talk.
Yeah.
Okay.
Be safe, and
Bye.
I'll leave you to the
All right.
work
Nice
that you
meeting you.
have. But I'll see you later. Bye.
Bye. Thank you.